Hey there, friends. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, I've got a story you're going to love. But before we settle in, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of these cozy tales. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always amazing to see our little storytelling circle stretch across the globe. Now dim those lights, get comfy, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The void before time had a name, and before the world had shape, there was nothing but silence and space, vast and endless, and waiting for something to happen. There were no stars, no sky, no wind, no sound, not even light or shadow. It was the deep stillness of Ginnungagap, the yawning gap, a place that existed between all things and yet was not a place at all. On one side of Ginnungagap was Niflheim, the world of mist and ice. It was cold beyond imagining, a land made from ancient frost, frozen rivers, and sharp winds that never stopped blowing. In the center of Niflheim was Hövergelmir, a bubbling, icy spring from which 12 rivers called the Elivagar flowed. These rivers twisted their way outward, reaching toward the gap and freezing as they went, layering the edge of Ginnungagap with brittle sheets of frost. On the opposite side was Muspelheim, a world of fire and light. It was wild and hot, full of lava, sparks, and swirling flames that danced like living spirits. The heat was fierce and untamed, guarded by a fire giant named Surt, who stood with a flaming sword and waited for a time that would come far in the future. Between these two worlds, ice and fire, cold and heat, lay Ginnungagap, the place of potential. It wasn't empty in the way a room is empty. It was more like a space that hadn't been filled yet, like a dream that hadn't been dreamed. As the icy rivers from Niflheim crept farther into Ginnungagap and met the heat of Muspelheim, something extraordinary happened. The fire began to melt the ice, and from the drops of melted water, the first life stirred. It wasn't born in the usual way because there were no mothers or fathers, no seasons or seeds, just warmth, meeting cold and making something new. From this melting ice came Ymir, the first being. He was a giant, enormous and powerful, but more than just a giant. He was the beginning of many things. Ymir was not kind or cruel, not wise or foolish. He simply was. And from his sweat, more life began to grow. As he slept, Ymir sweated, and from the sweat under his arms, a male and a female giant were born. From his legs came another son, and these children would become the frost giant, also called the Jotnar. They were wild and strong, like their ancestor, and would grow to fill the world with their kind. But Ymir was not the only creature born from the ice. Alongside him came a strange, gentle being, Ordumla, a giant cow with a calm presence and a gift of nourishment. She appeared from the same melting ice, created not from violence or force, but from the quiet magic of water and warmth. Ordumla fed Ymir with her milk, and he drank greedily. 4 rivers of milk flowed from her udders, enough to fill Ginnungagap with plenty. She wandered through the mist and frost, licking the salty ice for sustenance, her tongue slow and steady. As she licked the salty block, something new emerged. First, a hair, then a head, then a full body, tall and noble. This was Buri, the first of the gods. Unlike Ymir, who was shaped by accident, Buri had purpose and power. He was handsome and strong, silent at first, as though thinking through what he had been born into. Buri eventually had a son, named Bor, though how this came to be is a mystery lost to time. Bor grew up under the endless sky of Ginnungagap, and in time, he met Best, a giantess descended from Ymir's kin. Together, Bor and Bestla had 3 sons, Odin, Vili, and Ver. These 3 brothers were unlike any others. They were not giants, though part of them came from giant blood. They were gods, something new entirely, and they looked at the world with eyes that saw what could be, instead of what was. They were curious and bold, and they began to question the way things were. The world, as it was still wild and without order. Giants roamed free, and there was no sky or land as we know it, just chaos and emptiness. The brothers felt that this was not enough. They wanted to make something better, something more beautiful and meaningful. So they looked to Ymir, the ancestor of the giant, and realized that his body held the materials they would need. It was a dark thought, but it was clear to them. If they were to build a new world, they would have to destroy the old. Together, Odin, Vili, and Ve rose against Ymir and attacked him. It was a battle unlike any before, the first true war in the cosmos. Ymir was mighty, but the brothers were determined and filled with a vision that gave them strength. After a long and violent struggle, they defeated Ymir. When Ymir fell, his blood poured out in torrents, flooding the land and drowning nearly all of the giants. Only one family survived, the giant Bergelmir and his wife, who climbed into a wooden box and floated on the bloody flood waters until the world grew still again. With Ymir's body, the brothers began to create the world. His flesh became the land, soft and rich, forming hills and fields. His bones turned into the mountains, jagged and tall. His teeth and shattered bones formed the rocks and boulders scattered across the world. They used his blood to make the seas, the lakes, and rivers. It filled the deep places and flowed around the new land. His skull, they lifted into the sky and held it in place with 4 strong dwarves, north, south, east, and west, who became the pillars of the heavens. To make the stars, they reached into Muspelheim and gathered sparks from the realm of fire. They set them high in the sky as stars, and sent the sun and moon to ride in chariots across the heavens. Day and night began to pass, giving rhythm and time to the new world. They called this world Midgard, the middle realm, and it would be a place where humans would one day live. But first, they needed to protect, so they took Ymir's eyebrows and made a great wall around Midgard to keep out the surviving giants, who had gone to live in Jotunheim, the land of the Jotnar. Above Midgard, they created Asgard, the home of the gods. It floated high in the sky, connected to Midgard by the rainbow bridge called Bifrost, a shimmering path of light and magic. The gods made their homes there, proud halls and golden towers that watched over the new world. At the very center of all things grew Yggdrasil, the world tree. Its roots stretched deep into the realms and its branches reached into the sky, touching every world and connecting them like threads in a web. It was alive, full of wisdom and mystery, and from it flowed the power of all things. From the roots of Yggdrasil, 3 wells bubbled, one of wisdom, one of faith, and one of life itself. At one of these wells lived Mimir, a being of great knowledge, and at another sat the Norns, 3 sisters, who wove the fates of gods and men alike. The brothers looked at their creation and felt pride, but also a heavy awareness of what they had done. They had built a world, yes, but they had done it through death and struggle. That weight would never fully leave them, especially not Odin, who carried the burden of wisdom and foresight in his heart. Still, the world was beautiful. There were high mountains and deep valleys, rushing rivers and quiet forests, cold stars and warm sun. The winds carried the scent of salt from the sea and the whisper of trees rustling in the breeze. And for the first time, there was light in the sky and soil beneath the feet of those who walked the land. It was only the beginning. The rise of the gods. After the world had been shaped from the body of Ymir, the 3 brothers, Odin, Vili, and Ve, stood quietly for a time and looked over everything they had made. The mountains stretched far and wide, their peaks sometimes hidden behind low-lying clouds. Rivers sparkled under the sun's glow, winding through valleys and plains, with a gentle murmur that seemed to whisper the beginning of a song. The sky was alive with stars, and the flames of Muspelheim had been carefully placed in the heavens, as the sun and the moon. It was still a new world, fresh and almost fragile, and the gods felt the weight of responsibility settle onto their shoulders like a heavy cloak. But even in that beauty, the world felt empty. There was no one yet to walk the land, no voice to call out under the trees, no fire in a hearth, and no laughter echoing through a hall. It was all potential, waiting for something or someone to fill it. The gods wandered through their creation, each of them reflecting in their own way. Odin, who would one day be called the Allfather, was already beginning to think far beyond the present moment. He looked up at the sky and wondered what lay beyond even that, and he looked down at the soil beneath his feet and imagined who might one day walk upon it. His brothers, Vili and Ve, were quieter, but their eyes were bright with imagination. The three of them still worked together then, their bonds strong and full of shared purpose. In the middle of Midgard, the land they had made for people who had not yet come, the brothers walked along the edge of a sandy shore, where the sea whispered stories to the wind. There, among the driftwood washed up by the waves, they found two pieces of wood lying in the sand. One was the trunk of an ash tree, pale and strong. The other was from an elm tree, smoother, more flexible, but still sturdy. They paused and looked at these pieces of wood, feeling something stir inside them, something they couldn't quite name. It was as if the wood itself was waiting for a spark, a moment that would turn it from what it was into something new. Odin bent down and picked up the ash log in his hands, holding it with great care, almost reverence. Vili picked up the elm and turned it in his palm, weighing it as if trying to sense what it could become. Ve stepped between them and said softly, but clearly, "Let's make them live." And so they did. Odin leaned in first and gave them breath, the gift of life itself. The moment he did, the wood began to soften, as if the soul inside had awakened and needed a body to hold it. Vili gave them thought and movement, allowing their minds to stir and their limbs to stretch and feel. Ve gave them their senses, sight, hearing, touch, and all the ways they could understand the world around them. When they were finished, the pieces of wood were no longer just wood. They were people, the first humans, the man they named Ask, after the ash tree, the woman they called Embla for the elm. They stood naked and blinking in the light of the world, confused, but alive, like children waking from a long sleep. The gods smiled at what they had done. They dressed Ask and Embla in warm furs and taught them how to speak, how to eat, how to live with the land. They showed them how to light a fire, how to build shelter, and how to listen to the signs of the world, the birds in the sky, the movement of clouds, the whisper of trees. It was not just about surviving, it was about belonging to the world and caring for it. Ask and Embla were the first, but they would not be the last. From them would come all the families of humankind spread across Midgard, each one carrying the gifts the gods had given them. The gods watched with quiet joy as the humans began to build, to grow, and to dream. But the world was not without danger. Jotunheim, the land of the giants, still loomed beyond the protective walls of Midgard. Though many giants had perished in Ymir's blood, those who remained were strong, ancient, and often hostile. They saw what the gods had done, creating a new world, populating it with creatures that were small and delicate, and they did not approve. Some giants were curious, yes, and even respect, but others burned with hatred and envy. So the gods knew they had to be watchful. They needed a home from which they could rule, protect, and plan. That home became Asgard, a high realm above Midgard, connected by Bifrost, the great rainbow bridge. It shimmered in the sky like a ribbon of light, curving across the horizon with colors that seemed too vibrant to be real. In Asgard, the gods built halls and towers, gardens and gathering places. Odin's hall was called Valask, with a shining silver roof and a high throne, Hlodski, from which he could see all the realms. Asgard was a place of order and power, a golden city that reflected the dreams and strength of its builders. Over time, more gods came into being. Some were born of the older generations, while others seemed to come from the energies of the world itself. There was Thor, Odin's mighty son, with hair like fire, and arms like tree trunk, who would become the protector of gods and men alike. There was Frigg, Odin's wife, wise and calm, the goddess of love and family, who saw more than she ever said. There was Ty, brave and just, the god of law and war. There was Frey and Frey, twins from the Vanir tribe of gods, who would later join the Aesir and bring with them the gifts of fertility, peace and magic. But not all gods were the same. Among them walked Loki, the trickster. He was not born of the Aesir or Vanir, but came from the Jotnar. Yet he was accepted into the gods' circle, at least for a time. Loki was clever beyond compare, able to shift his shape and twist his words, always one step ahead of those around him. Sometimes he helped the gods with brilliant ideas or bold deeds. Other times he brought trouble, weaving chaos into everything he touched. Odin saw something in him, perhaps a reflection of the chaos that once filled Ginnungagap, or perhaps a challenge that he believed he could tame. As the gods settled into their roles and Asgard flourished, they began to explore the other realms. There were 9 worlds in all, linked by the branches and roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree. The gods traveled through these realms, learning their secrets and forming alliances or enemies. There was Alfheim, home of the light elves, radiant beings of beauty and magic, who lived in harmony with the world. There was Svartalfheim, where the dwarves worked deep underground, crafting weapons and tools of great power from stone and metal. There was Niflheim, the icy land of mists and shadows, and Muspelheim, still burning with the fire of creation. There was Helheim, a somber realm beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, where the dead who did not die in battle would go. The gods also came into contact with the Vanir, a different tribe of gods who lived in Vanir. The Vanir were close to nature, gifted in magic and the understanding of the earth's cycles. At first, the Aesir and Vanir clashed, 2 different powers, each thinking they knew best. But after a long and terrible war, they made peace. To seal the truce, they exchanged hostages. Njord, the sea god, and his children Frey and Freya came to live with the Aesir in Asgard. In return, the Aesir sent Mimir, the wise one, and Honir to live with the Vanir. Though the Vanir would never be fully absorbed into the Aesir's ways, the 2 groups found respect and balance in each other's strengths. Still, Odin remained restless. He had helped build the world, create life, and raise a city among the clouds, but it wasn't enough. He wanted knowledge, deep, endless, dangerous knowledge. He wanted to understand fate, to know what lay ahead, and to uncover the secrets that even gods feared to ask. He sought out Mimir, the guardian of the Well of Wisdom, hidden deep beneath the roots of Yggdrasil. Mimir agreed to let Odin drink from the well, but only if he paid a price, a great price. Odin did not hesitate. He plucked out his own eye and dropped it into the well. From that moment on, he saw differently, not just with his remaining eye, but with his mind and soul. He saw patterns in the stars, meanings in dreams, and threads of fate winding through the world like invisible rivers. Odin would go on to sacrifice more, much more in his search for truth, but the eye was the first. It marked him forever, not as a conqueror or a king, but as a seeker, a wanderer in search of wisdom no one else dared to hold. As Midgard grew, and people spread across its lands, worshipping the gods and building their own small kingdoms, the balance between the realms held firm for now. But even then, hidden in the shadows of all things, there were whispers of what was to come. The gods, for all their power, could not escape fate, and deep in Odin's thoughts, behind all the glory and creation, a single word echoed like a distant storm: Ragnarok. But that day was still far away, for now the gods stood tall in Asgard, the world below them full of light and life. The fire still burned in the sky, and the stars still blinked in the dark. The first people walked the land, telling stories of the gods who shaped their lives, while the gods themselves looked out over creation and wondered what would come next.
The trickster's path. Asgard was shining brighter than ever. Golden halls gleamed under the sky.
Music echoed through the wide courtyards, and laughter rang like bells in the cool air. It was a time of growth, of stories being told for the first time, and of the gods slowly becoming who they were meant to be. The people of Midgard were still new, but their fires flickered across the land like stars fallen to the earth. The world was full and brimming with life, and yet, as always, nothing stayed peaceful forever. Because where there is creation, there is change. And where there is change, there is mischief. And no one embodied mischief better than Loki. Now, Loki wasn't like the others in Asgard. He wasn't born in a golden hall or raised with the voices of gods in his ears. His father was Farbauti, a fierce giant with fire in his blood, and his mother was Lofe, slim and quick like the wind slipping between trees. From the start, Loki was different. He had a silver tongue, a sharp mind, and a restless spirit. He could shapeshift, change his voice, twist the truth until it sounded sweeter than honey, and he loved doing it. Despite his Jotun blood, Loki became blood brothers with Odin. No one knew exactly why Odin made that oath, binding their fates together forever. Some said Odin saw something useful in Loki's cleverness. Others whispered that he saw something dangerous and wanted it close enough to whatever the truth. Loki walked among the Aesir as one of them. Not always trusted, not always liked, but always there. Loki had a way of making himself necessary. When something broke, he could fix it. When something was missing, he could find it, or replace it with something better. He could talk his way out of nearly anything, or at the very least, drag someone else down with him. And in those early days the gods often forgave his mischief, even if it meant trouble, because sometimes Loki's schemes saved them in the end. One such tale began with Sif, Thor's wife, and her hair as golden as wheat fields in summer. She was known across the realms for her beauty, and that golden hair was her pride. Loki, ever curious and ever bored, decided it would be funny to sneak into her chamber while she slept, and shear off every strand of it. The next morning, Sif woke with a scream that could crack stone. Thor came running, saw her bald and sobbing, and knew instantly who was responsible. It wasn't hard to guess when things went wrong in Asgard. Loki's name was usually the first on everyone's tongue. Thor grabbed his hammer and stormed off, furious and ready to smash Loki into a fine red mist. But Loki, of course, had already heard the shouting and had wisely made himself very scarce. It didn't help. Thor found him anyway, dangling upside down from the highest tree in Asgard where he'd hidden himself, hoping to wait out the storm. Before Thor could turn him into a Loki-shaped crater, the trickster started talking. Wait, 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 he said, upside down and still trying to look calm. I have a plan to fix it. I'll get her better hair, magical hair. Hair made by the dwarf, golden as sunlight and never fades. She'll be even more beautiful than before. Trust me. Thor didn't trust him, not even a little, but he wanted Sif happy, and if Loki failed, well, he could always hit him later, so he let him go. Loki made his way to Svartalfheim, the land of the dwarves, master craftsmen of the 9 realms. He visited the sons of Ivaldi, renowned for their unmatched skill. He told them what had happened, swearing it wasn't his fault. The dwarves grumbled but agreed to help, crafting not only a new head of golden hair for Sif, but also 2 other treasures, a magic ship for Freya that could fold into a pocket, and a spear for Odin that never missed its mark. But Loki couldn't help himself. He had to take it one step further. He found 2 other dwarf brothers, Brokkr and Sindri, and challenged them. The sons of Ivaldi made amazing gifts, he said, but I bet you can't make anything better. The dwarves, proud and stubborn, took the bet. If Loki lost, he'd give them his head. They got to work in their forge, the fires burning hot and steady. Sindri worked the bellows while Brokkr handled the forge tools. As they crafted, Loki, in a panic, tried to sabotage them. He turned himself into a fly and bit Brokkr over and over to distract him. When that didn't stop the work, he bit so hard that Brokkr flinched for just a second. That was enough to slightly mess up the last item. Still, the dwarves made 3 incredible treasures: a golden boar that glowed in the dark, a magical golden ring that dripped other rings every 9th night, and a mighty hammer called Mjolnir. The handle of the hammer was a bit short, thanks to Loki's interference, but otherwise it was perfect, solid, unstoppable, and able to summon lightning itself. When the gods judged the gifts, the hammer won the day. It would become Thor's greatest weapon, and one of the most famous symbols of the god's strength. Loki, despite his attempt to cheat, had once again made himself useful, though he nearly lost his head in the process. That's how Loki worked. He pushed too far, always teetering on the edge of ruin, but somehow landing just on the safe side. Until, of course, the day he didn't, because Loki wasn't just mischief. He wasn't just jokes and tricks. There was something darker inside him too, something restless and growing. He wandered through the 9 realms more often than the other gods. He walked among the Ute, drinking mead in firelit caves and laughing with old giants whose names the gods preferred not to speak. He learned things, secrets, songs, spells. He had lovers in strange places and children born from unions that no one dared question aloud. From his union with the giantess Angrboda came 3 children that would shake the roots of the world. The first was Fenrir, the wolf, born already larger than a bear, with teeth like daggers and a hunger that could never be satisfied. The gods watched him grow with rising dread. The second was Jormung, the Midgard serpent. He grew so massive that he eventually encircled the entire world, his tail in his mouth, sleeping in the ocean's depths. The third was Hel, a daughter, who was half living, half dead, with one side of her face bright and beautiful, the other cold and lifeless as a corpse. Odin, seeing what these children could become, decided they couldn't be left free. He cast Jormungand into the sea, where he sank into the dark waters and wrapped around Midgard. He sent Hel to rule over the dead in the underworld that came to bear her name, Helheim. And Fenrir he brought to Asgard, hoping to keep him close and perhaps control him. For a while, the wolf pup grew among the gods. He played with Tyr, the god of war and law, who alone among them showed Fenrir kindness and respect. But Fenrir kept growing, larger and more fierce by the day. The gods began to fear him, whispering behind his back, avoiding his gaze. They decided he must be bound. They tried using chains, the strongest iron forged by the dwarves. Fenrir snapped them like twigs. They tried heavier chains, thicker and dark, with runes carved deep into their length. Still, Fenrir broke free. Finally, they asked the dwarves to make something unbreakable, not from strength, but from strangeness. The dwarves created Gleipnir, a silken ribbon made from the sound of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. Things that did not exist yet somehow did. The gods brought the ribbon to Fenrir and told him it was a test of strength, just for fun. Fenrir, not stupid, sensed their fear and suspicion. He agreed to the test, but only if one of them put their hand in his mouth as a sign of trust. Tyr, brave and sorrowful, stepped forward and placed his right hand between Fenrir's jaws. As the ribbon tightened and Fenrir found he could not break free, he snapped his jaws shut and bit off Tyr's hand. The god of law screamed, but did not curse. Fenrir was chained, but not broken. He howled and raged, his eyes burning with betrayal. The gods left him there deep beneath the earth, bound but not forgotten. Loki said little during all this. His children had been torn from him, his name spoken with more suspicion than ever. A seed of bitterness had taken root inside him, and bitterness, like fire, grows if fed. But still he smiled, still he laughed, still he danced through the halls of Asgard with his clever tongue and sparkling eyes. Still he told stories and whispered ideas and made himself useful. But deep down a storm was forming, a storm with Loki at its heart. And the gods, all their wisdom and all their power, would one day feel the fury of that storm. The Wanderer's wisdom. The days in Asgard were golden, long, and filled with songs. But beneath the laughter and feasting, something stirred in the heart of the Allfather. Odin, ruler of the Aesir, sat often in thought these days, his one eye peering far into the distance, through clouds, wind, and time itself. While others fought and drank and told tales, Odin hungered for something else. Not wine or war, or even victory, He hungered for knowledge. Knowledge to him was the true strength. Swords could be broken, spells could be forgotten, even gods could die. But wisdom, that stayed, that guided everything else. He had already given one of his eyes to Mimir's well, long ago, trading sight for sight, vision of the world for vision of truth. He wore the gap in his face with pride, because what he had gained was greater than any jewel. But it wasn't enough, not even close. Odin knew that somewhere, far beyond the ordinary paths of gods and men, there were deeper secrets, the kind of truth that shaped the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and echoed through every branch of fate. He wanted to understand the runes, not just to carve them on weapons and charms, but to know them, to feel them in his bones and speak the hidden language of the cosmos. So one morning, without telling the others, Odin left his hall. He wrapped himself in a dark cloak, pulled his wide-brimmed hat low over his missing eye, and walked the path only wanderers take. He walked and walked farther than the lands of men, beyond the snow-laced edges of Jotunheim, until he stood before Yggdrasil itself. The tree was massive, its roots like mountain ridges, its leaves brushing the stars. Birds sang in its branches, creatures moved within its bark, and the wind around it was not just air, it was memory. At the base of Yggdrasil, Odin stood and looked up. "I must know," he whispered. "I must see what lies behind the veil of the runes. Let me give myself to the tree." And Yggdrasil listened. Odin took a spear, his own spear, Gungnir, the one forged by dwarves and sharpened with oath, and stabbed himself through the side. Blood poured from the wound, soaking the roots of the tree. Then without a sound, he climbed up, until he found a branch that creaked with ancient power. Then he hung himself. For 9 eyes and 9 nights, Odin hung on Yggdrasil, swaying gently in the wind, pierced and bleeding, with no food, no drink, and no comfort. His body trembled, his mind blurred, but his will remained sharp as the edge of his spear. He saw visions, shapes dancing in the mist, voices whispering riddles, faces from the past and future alike. Ravens circled him, calling his name in strange echoes, and all around him the tree hummed. It didn't speak in words but in meanings, in patterns too deep for language. Then as the 9th night fell and the sky shifted into a curtain of shadow and starlight, something clicked in Odin's mind. The runes revealed themselves, not carved into wood or stone, but floating alive inside his soul. He understood them, not just what they meant, but how they meant, how they moved, how they grew like roots seeking water. He gasped, and with that breath fell from the tree. He didn't die, not fully. He returned, changed, his face paler, his eye sharp, and his spirit heavier with secrets. He picked himself up from the base of Yggdrasil, wiped the blood from his hands, and walked back into the world. From that day he carried the runes in his heart. He could use them to heal, to bless, to curse, to foresee. He shared some with the gods, few with men, and held many for himself. But Odin's quest for wisdom didn't stop there. He sought Mimir again, the wise one whose head still whispered secrets from beneath the roots of the tree. Mimir's well still bubbled, still shimmered with truths too strong for unready minds. Odin sat beside it, listening. Sometimes he'd talk to the dead, calling the spirits of long-fallen warriors or ancient seers to speak with him. He'd ask them questions no living being could answer. He wandered in disguise, old man, beggar, traveler with riddles on his tongue, visiting kings, witches, giants, and ghosts, collecting slivers of knowledge wherever he could find them. He even went to the realm of the dead, Helheim itself, seeking a long-forgotten Velva, a seeress who had once known the fate of the world. He disguised himself as a living man, and in the shadows of that cold place he asked her what she saw. She spoke of things that chilled his blood, of the end of the gods, of Fenrir's rage, of Jormungand rising from the sea, of Loki standing against them, laughing with fire in his eyes. She told him of Ragnarok, Odin listened in silence. When she was done, he offered no thanks. He simply turned and left, his footsteps echoing in the land of silence. He returned to Asgard even more changed. His wisdom now had a shadow behind it, a weight that none of the others could see. He knew that even the gods had a death waiting for them, that their story, ever glorious, would end one day. But Odin didn't run from that fate. He didn't try to undo it. Instead, he worked to prepare. He chose warriors carefully now, those fallen in battle, who would one day fight at his side in the final war. He sent Valkyries to guide them to Valhalla, the hall of the honored dead, where they feasted by night and trained by day. He gathered knowledge, forged alliances, and watched the skies for signs. His two ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, flew across the 9 realms each morning, and returned each evening to whisper everything they'd seen. Odin listened, always listening. He spoke less now, but when he did, the other gods listened too. Even Thor, loud and proud, lowered his voice in his father's presence. Even Loki, for all his cleverness, watched Odin carefully, as if measuring just how much the Allfather truly knew. The halls of Asgard echoed with new songs, songs of battles past, yes, but also of shadows in the east and cold winds from the north. Giants were stirring again in Jotunheim, strange omens floated in the rivers, and wolves howled longer than they should have beneath the moon. Odin watched it all, and still he searched. One day he rode Sleipnir, his 8-legged steed, deep into the land of the giants, alone and unannounced. He walked into the hall of Vafthrudnir, the wisest of the Jotun, a massive being older than some stars. Odin didn't reveal his name. He called himself Gangredra, the Wanderer, and challenged the giant to a battle of riddles. They sat across from each other, words flying like arrow, questions twisting like vines. Odin asked about the beginning of the world, about the birth of the gods, about the hidden names of things. Vafthrudnir answered them all. Then the giant asked his own questions about the fate of the gods, about the day they would fall. Odin answered in turn, calm and clear. But then he asked the final question. What did Odin whisper into the ear of his son Balder as he lay dead upon the pyre? Vafthrudnir's face changed. He leaned back, eyes wide, and knew he had been speaking with Odin himself. And he realized then that he would lose, because only Odin had known that whisper, that last breath between father and son. The giant bowed his head, and the contest was over. Odin rode back to Asgard, his mind full, his heart heavier still. The threads of fate were weaving tighter now. The future wasn't a distant thought, it was a storm on the horizon. But still, the gods lived their days. Thor battled monsters and drank oceans. Freya danced in her feathered cloak, and wept for lost lovers. Loki smiled and schemed, his laughter sometimes too loud, sometimes too quiet. And Odin watched, the wise wanderer, the sacrifice, the king with one eye, who saw more than most with two. He had given much for knowledge, blood, pain, years, family, trust, and he would give more still before the end. But for now, he prepared, because Ragnarok was no longer just a prophecy, it was a promise. The Thunderer's path. Thor was not a quiet god. If Odin was the whisper of fate, then Thor was the roar of the storm. He didn't spend his time in riddles or mysteries. Thor believed in action, in the swing of his hammer, in the charge of battle, in the simple and honest sound of laughter and thunder rolling together. And yet, even Thor, the strongest of the Aesir, was beginning to feel the weight of the changing times. It wasn't just that giants were growing bolder, or that monsters crept closer to the walls of Asgard. It was something deeper, a sense in his bones that the days were shifting, that even the mighty needed to be ready for what was coming. Still, Thor did what he always did. He fought. His hammer, Mjolnir, was not just a weapon, it was an extension of him. Forged by the dwarves Brokkr and Sindri, it was short-handled because Loki, of course, had meddled in its making. But Thor never complained. It suited him just fine. With it he could level mountains, crack open the skulls of frost giants, and call lightning from the sky with a flick of his wrist. He traveled off riding in a chariot pulled by two goats, Tooth Gnasher and Tooth Grinder, who could be killed and eaten each night and then brought back to life the next morning, as long as their bones remained whole. It was a convenient trick, and Thor loved a hearty meal. One day Thor felt a disturbance along the borders of Midgard, the realm of men. The skies were darker than usual, but not with clouds. It was magic deep, old, and wrong. He didn't hesitate. Grabbing Mjolnir, he called his goats and leapt into his chariot, the wheels spitting fire as they tore through the sky. He landed in a valley where rivers had frozen mid-flow and trees had been twisted into jagged, unnatural shapes. The air stank of ice magic, the kind used by the worst of the frost giants. From the shadows stepped Hrungnir, a stone giant known for his brute strength and arrogance. Hrungnir's head was made of stone, his heart of cold rock, and his feet like slabs of the earth itself. He had a shield made of stone, and a weapon carved from a mountain's root. "I've come for you, Thunderer," Hrungnir growled, his voice like grinding boulders. Thor raised an eyebrow. "Then you've come for a beating," he replied with a smirk. They clashed with a thunderous roar that shook Midgard to its bones. Lightning split the sky, and hail fell like arrows. Thor swung Mjolnir, and each blow rang like a war drum. Across the realms, Hrungnir struck back, hammering the earth with his massive fists. But stone, no matter how strong, breaks, and after a long and brutal fight, Thor brought his hammer down with a cry that echoed across the mountains and cracked Hrungnir's skull wide open. The giant fell, shaking the world with his final breath. But the battle left Thor weary. The world was filling with more like Hrungnir giants who no longer feared Asgard, who whispered that the end was coming, and that the gods were not as mighty as they once were. Thor returned to Asgard, dragging Hrungnir's heavy stone head as proof of victory. The gods feasted in his honor that night, and the mead flowed like rivers. But Thor didn't drink as much as usual. He sat with his arm around Sif, his golden-haired wife, and stared at the fire, wondering what challenge would come next. It wasn't long before he found out. The next morning, Thor woke to find Mjolnir missing. At first he thought it was a joke, maybe Loki playing one of his tricks. He stormed through the halls of Asgard, shaking doors and roaring, but the hammer was nowhere to be found. Without it, the gods were vulnerable. Mjolnir wasn't just Thor's weapon, it was their greatest defense. Its presence alone kept the giants at bay. He cornered Loki, who of course denied everything, at first. But Thor's glare could melt glaciers. Loki finally sighed and muttered, Fine, I'll find it. But you owe me." Thor grunted. "You'll get a punch if you don't move faster." Loki borrowed Freya's falcon cloak and flew across the realms. He found Thrym, king of the frost giants, sitting smugly on his frozen throne. Thrym did it easily. He had stolen Mjolnir and buried it 8 leagues beneath the earth. "I'll give it back," Thrym said, "but only if Freya marries me." Loki snorted with laughter and flew back to Asgard. When Freya heard, she was furious. Her eyes flashed, and her necklace, Brisingamen, shook with her fury. "Over my dead body," she snapped. A council of the gods was called. The stakes were too high. Without the hammer they were exposed. Heimdall, the ever-watchful guardian of Bifrost, spoke up first. "Then let Thor wear a dress," Heimdall said, dead serious. "Let him go as the bride." There was a long silence. Then Thor bellowed, "What? Me? In a wedding dress?" But as the laughter died, the truth settled in. There was no other way. Loki grinned wickedly. "I'll be your handmaiden," he said with a wink. So Thor, the mighty god of thunder, found himself squeezed into a bridal gown, his beard tucked as best as it could be, and a veil placed over his scowling face. Loki fussed over him, adjusting flowers and smoothing fabric, clearly enjoying every second. They traveled to Jotunheim, arriving at Thrym's hall to the sound of drums and icy cheers. Thrym, not the brightest of giants, was too excited to notice that his bride had shoulders like tree trunks and eyes that burned with thunder. The feast began. Thor, hungry from rage and travel, devoured entire trays of food, ripped through roasted ox, and drank barrels of mead in single gulps. Thrym whispered nervously to Loki, "Is she always this hungry?" Loki, ever quick, replied, "Oh yes, she fasted for 8 days out of excitement." Thrym nodded, impressed. Later, when he leaned in to kiss his bride, he recoiled from Thor's furious gaze. "Her eyes," he gasped, "they burn like lightning." Loki said smoothly, "It's just love. She's overwhelmed." Finally, Thrym brought forth Mjolnir as part of the wedding gift, placing it in Thor's lap. And that was the end of the charade. Thor grabbed the hammer, tore off the veil, and unleashed a fury no giant ever forgot. He stood up, his dress torn, his eyes blazing, and he leveled Thrym's entire hall. Mjolnir spun in his hands like a storm, and giants flew in every direction. When it was over, the snow was red, the walls shattered, and Thor stood in the center of the wreckage, laughing with triumph. He returned to Asgard still wearing pieces of the dress, his beard soaked with sweat and battle. The gods roared with laughter. Even Odin allowed himself a grin. But beneath the humor, they knew the truth. The hammer had nearly been lost, and the giants were getting bolder. Thor stood at the walls of Asgard that night, gazing across the worlds, Mjolnir in his hand. He thought of his children, Magni and Modi, strong and wise, and Thrym, his fierce daughter. He thought of the promise Odin once made that they would rise again even after the end. He didn't know if he believed it, but he knew this: as long as he could lift his hammer, as long as he could breathe, no enemy would pass without a fight. Thunder rolled across the sky, and Thor smiled. The trickster's games. The halls of Asgard had seen many things, but none quite like the arrival of Loki, the god of mischief. He was not a god of straightforward valor or strength like Thor, nor a wise and patient god like Odin. Loki was the chaos that lived at the edges of order, the one who could twist the fabric of reality with a smile and a flick of his finger. No one ever knew what to expect from him. Loki's laughter echoed down the golden halls, a sound that was both intoxicating and unnerving. The gods and goddesses of Asgard had learned long ago to keep one eye on him at all times. He was clever, yes, perhaps more clever than any other, but his tricks were often dangerous. Still, Loki was always present at their feasts, always at the center of their gatherings, even though no one quite trusted him. Odin knew that Loki's presence was necessary, for without him, life in Asgard would be too predictable, too comfortable, and that was a fate even Odin feared. Loki was a god of both creation and destruction, often blending the two in a way that left everyone both in awe and horror. He had a knack for turning the simplest of tasks into a matter of life or death, and that was the charm and the danger of him. He had the ability to make even the dullest moment sparkle with the promise of something dangerous and unexpected. It was during one of these quiet moments that Loki's latest scheme began to take shape. The gods had gathered in the hall for a feast, as they often did, their minds at ease, and their bellies full of mead and roasted meats. But even amidst the laughter and the toasts, Loki's eyes gleamed with an idea, something far more complicated than the usual trickery. This time, it wasn't just about causing a little chaos. It was about testing something far greater, something that had the potential to shake the very foundations of Asgard itself. Loki had long grown bored of the usual tricks, turning himself into a fish, a fly, or even a mare. But tonight, he had something else in mind, something far more audacious. He stood raising his goblet to the gods, his eyes gleaming with mischief. As he addressed the hall, "I propose a challenge," he said, his voice smooth and sly. "A contest of wit, strength, and cunning, the likes of which Asgard has never seen before." The gods fell silent, intrigued, despite themselves. Even Thor, who was never one to engage in anything that didn't involve a good fight, leaned forward with interest. Odin, ever the observer, narrowed his eyes, sensing that Loki was up to something, something more than just another petty prank. "What do you propose, Loki?" Odin asked, his voice steady, though there was a hint of weariness in his tone. Loki grinned. "I will gather a team, and each team will be tasked with completing 3 trials. Trials that will test not only strength, but skill, courage, and the ability to think outside the box. And if you fail?" Thor asked, his voice gruff, as he folded his arms across his chest. Loki's grin widened. "Oh, that's the best part, my friend. Failure comes with consequences." At this, the gods shifted uneasily in their seats, none more so than Frey, who was always cautious about making wagers with Loki. But Loki was already moving, gathering his team from among the gods, and before long, the challenge was set. Thor, of course, was determined to win. His pride and his love for battle made him a fierce competitor, even if the contest wasn't about smashing things to pieces. Sif, his wife, would be his partner in the first trial. Her grace and quick thinking balanced his strength perfectly. Freya, the goddess of love and beauty, but also a skilled warrior, paired with Tyr, the god of war and justice. And Loki, ever the trickster, teamed up with the clever and resourceful Idun, the keeper of the golden apples that kept the gods young. The first trial was to navigate the labyrinth of shadows, a maze of dark, shifting pathways that constantly changed to confuse and disorient anyone who dared to enter. It was a place known to play on one's deepest fears, and none of the gods had ever ventured through it before. The labyrinth was located at the edge of the world, a dark, forgotten realm where the shadows themselves seemed to breathe and twist in unnatural ways. As the team stepped into the labyrinth, the air grew cold and heavy, and the shadows began to dance, swirling around them like whispers. Thor gripped Mjolnir tight, ready to strike at anything that moved, but Sif held up a hand, her senses sharp. "Wait, Thor," she said softly. "Listen." There was something strange in the air, a subtle, unspoken warning that urged them to be cautious. But Thor, as always, was eager to charge ahead, his heart pounding for the thrill of the unknown. "Come on, Sif," he grinned. "We can handle this." They moved forward, each step more treacherous than the last. The shadows seemed to reach for them, tugging at their ankle, whispering their darkest thoughts. Sif, however, moved with an elegance that came from years of practice and discipline. She could feel the shadows testing her, pushing her toward fear and doubt, but she didn't falter. Meanwhile, Loki's team was moving swift, weaving through the labyrinth with ease. Loki's laughter echoed in the shadows as he and Idun twisted through the maze, their quick thinking guiding them around traps and dead ends. But even Loki couldn't deny the growing unease that settled in his stomach. The labyrinth was not just a maze, it was alive, and it seemed to be studying, testing their very souls. The final trial, however, was what truly shook the gods to their core. They had to face the beast of the void, a creature older than time itself, born from the darkest corners of the cosmos. Its eyes glowed with the light of distant stars, and its breath was the cold emptiness between worlds. To defeat, they had to prove that they were more than just warriors. They had to conquer their own inner darkness. As they faced the creature, each god was forced to confront their own fears and weaknesses. Thor found himself standing before the darkness of his own rage, his need to destroy everything in his path. Sif had to face her fear of losing those she loved most, her love for Thor blinding her to the chaos around her. Loki, however, stood alone in the face of the beast, his laughter gone, replaced by a quiet seriousness. He was not afraid of the dark, nor of the beast, but of what lay beyond it, the void, the nothingness that had always threatened to swallow him whole. Loki had always danced on the edge of existence, but here in the face of the beast, he realized that even a trickster could be undone by the emptiness. The gods fought with all their might, but it was Loki who found the key to defeating the creature. With his sharp mind and deep understanding of the void, he tricked the beast into its own reflection, trapping it in an endless cycle of nothingness. The creature vanished, its monstrous form dissolving into the very air it had once filled. The gods, weary but triumphant, returned to Asgard, their bonds stronger for having faced the darkness together. But Loki was not content. He had won the challenge, yes, but there was something deeper at play here. Something he had learned in the labyrinth, something that whispered to him in the silence after the battle. As the gods celebrated their victory, Loki withdrew to the shadows, contemplating the strange, dark things that had stirred within him during the trials. And in the silence of the hall, where even the gods' laughter couldn't quite touch him, Loki's mind began to weave new plans, new tricks, and even darker games to play. The game was never truly over. The fates loom. There were many things that could be said about the gods of Asgard, but one thing remained constant. They were all at the mercy of time. Time, that invisible force that bent even the mightiest gods to its will, was something none of them could escape, no matter how much power they wielded or how vast their wisdom. Time, after all, was woven into the very fabric of the Nine Realms, and it had a way of creeping up on even the most indomitable of beings. The Norns, those ancient beings who wove the threads of fate, understood time better than any of the gods. They were the weavers of the universe, each thread representing the life of a god, a giant, or even a mortal. The Norns lived beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree, in a realm where the past, present, and future all swirled together in a constant, eternal dance. The Norns were beyond the reach of Odin's wisdom, even beyond the power of Thor's hammer. They had no need for brute force or clever tricks. They wove the tapestry of destiny itself, and no one, god or giant, could break their weave. Odin, the All-Father, had long been aware of the Norns' power. He had sought their counsel many times throughout the ages, though he knew that their answers were not always as clear as he would have liked. The Norns did not deal in certainties or guarantees. They spoke in riddles, in cryptic words, and their visions were not always easy to understand. Still, Odin was nothing if not persistent, and he had learned that sometimes the only way to understand the future was to face it, no matter how uncertain or dangerous that future might seem. It was during one of these moments of uncertainty that Odin decided to seek out the Norns once more. The signs in the skies had become more ominous as of late, and the winds carried whispers of something far greater than the usual giants and beasts that threatened the Nine Realms. There was something shifting in the fabric of existence, and Odin knew that he had to learn more, or else risk being caught unprepared when whatever it was finally arrived. With a heavy heart, Odin gathered his cloak around him and set off on a journey to the roots of Yggdrasil, where the Norns resided. He left Asgard in the hands of Thor, who was, as all, ready to defend the realm with his strength and Mjolnir. But even Thor's might could not protect them from the unseen forces that were stirring in the shadows. And Odin knew that the knowledge of the Norns might be their only hope. The journey was long and treacherous, for the path to the roots of Yggdrasil was not one taken lightly. The road wound through forests filled with creatures of legend, and the air grew thick with ancient magic as Odin traveled deeper into the heart of the realm. His thoughts wandered as he walked, remembering the many trials he had faced over the years, his sacrifice on the world tree to gain the knowledge of the runes, his endless search for wisdom, and the countless battles that had shaped his reign. But all of that seemed insignificant compared to the task before him now. The world was changing, and Odin felt the weight of it pressing against him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Odin arrived at the dark well where the Norns resided. The air around him was thick with the smell of earth and moss, and the sound of flowing water echoed in the distance. As he stepped closer, the darkness seemed to swirl around him, and he could sense the presence of the Norns watching him from the shadows. Without a word, Odin knelt before the well and spoke the ancient words that would summon the Norns. The ground trembled beneath him, and a voice, deep and ancient, filled the air, as if the earth itself was speaking to him. "Odin, All-Father," the voice intoned, "what brings you to our realm?" Odin looked up, his one remaining eye glowing with the wisdom of ages. "I seek knowledge of the future," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of his request. "I have seen signs, and I fear that something terrible is coming. I need to know what the threads of fate have woven for the Nine Realms." There was a long silence before the Norns spoke again, their voices soft but firm. You know, All-Father, that the future is not set in stone. The threads of fate are always shifting, always changing. What you seek is not a simple answer, for the future is full of possibility, each one leading to another. Odin's brow furrowed, but he said nothing. He had expected as much. The Norns were not known for providing clear answers. They dealt in uncertainty, in the ebb and flow of fate's current, and their wisdom was often as difficult to grasp as the wind. The signs I have seen, Odin pressed, speak of the end times of Ragnarok. His voice was low, as if even speaking the name of the final battle brought him closer to it. I need to know if this is truly what awaits us. The Norns were silent for a long time, their presence heavy in the air. Finally, one of them spoke, a voice like the rustling of leaves in the wind. Ragnarok is inevitable, All-Father, but it is not as simple as you think. It will come, but not in the way you expect. The threads of fate are not as clear-cut as they seem. Odin's heart sank as he listened to the Norns' words. He had always known that Ragnarok was a part of the fate that had been woven for the gods, but hearing it spoken aloud so plainly made it feel all the more real. The end of everything, the destruction of Asgard, the fall of the gods. It was a terrifying thought, one that he had hoped was still far off in the distance. The fates are ever changing, the Norn continued, and while Ragnarok may come, it will not be the end of all things. There will be rebirth, and from the ashes of the old, new life will rise. The question is not whether Ragnarok will come, but what will you do with the time you have left? Odin stood in silence, the weight of the Norns' words pressing heavily upon him. He had always known that his time was limited, that even the gods were not immune to the passage of time. But to hear it spoken so plainly, to hear that the end was approaching, was something he was not yet ready to accept. Do not fear the end, Odin, the Norn said softly, her voice filled with an ancient wisdom, for it is in the face of destruction that the seeds of creation are sown. The fates have been woven, and there is no turning back, but there is always hope, always the possibility for change. Odin nodded slowly, taking in the Norn's words. He had always known that fate was not a force to be defied, but perhaps there was still room for him to act, to guide the gods towards something different, something better. But first he would have to face the truth of what was coming, and what it would mean for his people, for the gods, and for all of creation. As he left the Norn's realm, the air around him seemed heavy, the weight of destiny pressing against him like never before. But there was something else too, something that lingered in his heart. A spark of hope, however faint, that perhaps the end of the gods was not the end of everything. The threads of fate had been woven, and Ragnarok was coming, but Odin was determined to face it, to shape the future as best as he could, even if the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger. As he made his way back to Asgard, Odin's thoughts were filled with the words of the Norns, and he knew that the time for action was drawing near. The gods could no longer sit idly by, waiting for the end to come. They had to prepare to fight, and to face the coming storm, with everything they had. The final battle was approaching, and it would require every god, every warrior, and every ounce of strength to survive. Odin knew that the fate of the 9 realms rested in their hands, and he would do whatever it took to protect his people, even if it meant facing the end of the world itself. The rising storm. The skies above Asgard had long been clear, but the peace that blanketed the realm was one that was slowly being suffocated by an ominous pressure, a heaviness that seemed to settle over the gods with each passing day. And was a weight that no one could ignore, not even Thor, who typically would have been more concerned with the next battle or feast. But even his mighty hammer, Mjolnir, felt a little heavier in his grasp, as though it too could sense the coming storm, both in the physical world and the hearts of those around him. Odin, ever watchful, stood upon the high balcony of Valhalla, gazing out at the horizon. His single eye narrowed as he contemplated the whispers that had reached him from the farthest reaches of the realms. His mind was restless, as though his very soul could feel the rumblings of the chaos that was beginning to unfurl. He had sought the counsel of the Norns, but even they had given him no clear answers. just the cryptic promise of rebirth after destruction, a cycle he had come to understand but never fully embrace. He knew that the end was coming, but what would follow it was still unknown, even to him. As the days passed, the feeling of impending doom grew stronger. It wasn't just the strange weather patterns or the unsettling visions that had started appearing in the dreams of the gods. It was something more tangible, something that lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. The winds howled in a language that none could understand, and the stars above seemed to flicker as though they too were unsure of their place in the sky. The very fabric of the 9 realms seemed to be unraveling, thread by thread, and the gods were powerless to stop it. Thor, who had always been a god of action, found himself pacing more and more these days, his thoughts scattered, his once boisterous nature subdued. He had fought countless battles and faced monstrous foes without fear, but this, the uncertainty that hung in the air, was something he could not strike with his hammer. He had been preparing for Ragnarok his whole life, but even he knew that this was not just another battle, not just another clash of armies. This was something deeper, something that reached into the very essence of existence itself, and it left him feeling helpless in a way that made his usual confidence seem distant and foreign. Freya, the goddess of love, beauty and war, had always been more attuned to the subtle shifts in the world, the quiet tremors that moved beneath the surface of reality. She had been feeling restless for weeks, as though something was stirring in the very core of her being, something that called to her but could not be fully understood. Her intuition told her that the gods were not ready for what was coming, and yet there was little anyone could do to prepare for an enemy they could not see or understand. The warriors of Valhalla, the fiercest of the gods, had gathered in their hall, waiting for orders, but none of them knew what to do. They had been trained for war, for combat, for glory on the battlefield, but they had never been prepared for the kind of war that was coming, one that could tear apart not just their bodies but their very souls. The echoes of Ragnarok were in the air, but it wasn't just the end of days that they had to face. It was a war for the very nature of existence itself, and no one could say for sure who would survive it or what would remain when it was over. It was during one of these restless nights, when the sky had darkened prematurely and the stars blinked faintly as though they too feared the coming storm, that Odin gathered the gods in the great hall of Valhalla. The large open space was filled with the echoes of ancient warriors, and the grand feast table, which usually saw revelry and cheer, now felt cold, the shadows cast by the torches more oppressive than usual. Odin stood at the head of the hall, his stern face illuminated by the flickering firelight, and for once his voice was not filled with the usual commanding force. It was softer, tinged with something that could only be described as sorrow. "My children," Odin began, his voice carrying the weight of years of wisdom and regret, "the time has come for us to prepare for the inevitable. We have all felt it, the storm that approaches, the trembling of the very threads that bind our worlds together. Ragnarok is not just a myth, not a distant tale to be sung of in the halls of Asgard. It is real, and it is coming faster than we thought." Thor gripped Mjolnir tighter, his jaw set in a determined line, but even he could not hide the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had always fought with a clear purpose, always charged into battle with a heart full of fire and courage. But now, as his father spoke, he felt something that he had not felt before, a fear that he could not name. Freya's eyes too were filled with a quiet sorrow, for she knew that even the gods could not escape the fate that was waiting for them. She had always known that love and war were inextricably linked, that beauty and destruction were two sides of the same coin, but even she had not fully understood the depth of the storm they were about to face. "I have seen the signs," Odin continued, his gaze sweeping over the gathered gods, "and they are not kind. The forces that are approaching will be unlike anything we have faced before. We must unite, not just as gods, but as a force greater than the sum of our parts." It was then that Loki, the trickster god, spoke, his voice light and almost carefree, as though the gravity of the situation had not yet settled in his mind. "Well, Odin," he said, a smirk curling on his lips, "I trust that we will be doing what we do best, playing a little trick or two to keep things interesting. Loki's words, though light-hearted, were met with no laughter, for the gods knew that this was not a time for games. Even Loki, for all his trickery, could not hide the sense of dread that had settled into the very marrow of his bones. He had always been a god who thrived in the face of chaos, but now, even he could sense the weight of the storm that was coming, a storm unlike any he had ever dared to imagine. Odin's gaze softened as he looked at his son, understanding the hidden fear behind his jest. The storm that approaches is not one that can be outwitted. Loki, he said gravely, it is a force of nature itself, a culmination of all things, and no trickery will save us. Loki's smile faltered, and for a brief moment, even he seemed uncertain. For all his cleverness, even he knew that there were some things beyond his reach, some forces even he could not twist or manipulate. The gods fell silent, each one lost in their own thoughts, their minds turning over the words of Odin and the weight of the coming storm. The storm was not just a physical threat, it was a spiritual one, a force that would test their hearts and their very wills. It would push them to the limits of their strength, their resolve, and perhaps even their survival. And yet, even in the face of this overwhelming dread, there was something else, something that stirred within them, something ancient and powerful. A strength that had always been there but had never been fully realized. They were gods after all, and if anyone had the power to survive the coming storm, it was them. Odin's voice broke the silence, steady and firm. We will face this storm together, he said, his words carrying the weight of destiny itself. No matter what comes, no matter how impossible it may seem, we will stand united. And when the storm has passed, we will rebuild, stronger than ever before. And with those words, the gods knew what they had to do. The storm was coming, and it would tear through the 9 realms like a but they would face it head on, with all the strength and power they could muster. For though the storm was inevitable, so too was their resolve, and they would not let the darkness take them without a fight. As the gods of Asgard made their preparation, the wind outside began to howl once more, and the first crack of thunder sounded in the distance. The storm had arrived, and with it, the fate of the 9 realms hung in the balance. The edge of twilight. As the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the gods of Asgard found themselves preparing for something they had only heard whispered about in ancient tales. Ragnarok, the end of the world. It had always been a distant, abstract concept, something foretold to happen in the far-off future, something the gods thought they could outlast or perhaps even avoid. But as the first crack of thunder echoed across the heavens, it became clear that the end was no longer a myth. It was a reality, one that would shape their destinies in ways they could not yet understand. Odin stood in the great hall of Valhalla, staring at the dark sky beyond, his thoughts heavy with the weight of all that was to come. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, the responsibility of leadership, the deep sorrow for what was about to unfold, and the bitter realization that there was no way to avoid the inevitable. He had known this day would come, of course. Every god, every warrior, had known it in their bones, even if they had pretended otherwise. But now, in the face of the storm, it all seemed too real, too close. Beside him stood Thor, his hammer Mjolnir gripped tightly in his hand, the storm in his eyes reflecting the storm brewing in the sky above. Thor, the god of thunder, had always been brash and eager for battle, but now there was a rare solemnity in his stance. Even his boisterous nature, his love of combat and competition, seemed diminished by the weight of the coming apocalypse. For the first time in his life, Thor understood that this was not just a battle for honor or for glory. This was a fight for survival, and there were no guarantees. Freya, too, stood in the hall, her graceful form casting a long shadow as she watched the others prepare. Her eyes, though calm, betrayed a deep, almost palpable sorrow. As the goddess of love and war, she had always understood the fragile balance between creation and destruction, but never had she felt so helpless. In the face of such overwhelming fate, she had led countless armies, fought battles in both the physical and spiritual realms, and witnessed the rise and fall of many great warriors. But even she could sense that this battle was unlike any other. Around them, the warriors of Valhalla prepared for the great battle that loomed on the horizon. They donned their armor, sharpened their weapons, and made final preparations, each one knowing that the fight they were about to face could be their last. But there was no fear in their hearts, at least none that they would show. They were the chosen ones, the greatest of the gods, the mightiest warriors ever to walk the 9 realms, and they would stand and fight with everything they had. In Valhalla, death was a victory, and so long as they could die fighting, they would never truly be gone. But even amidst this bravado, even as the gods readied themselves for the coming battle, there was a quiet understanding that something was different about this fight. This was not just another clash between the gods and their enemies. This was the final conflict, the one that would decide the fate of all things. It would not end with a victory, a celebration, and the return to the feast halls of Asgard. No, this would be the end of the gods' reign, the destruction of all they had built, and the birth of something new, something unrecognizable. Odin's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him, and he turned to see Loki walking toward him, his usual mischievous grin replaced by something much more serious. Loki, the trickster, had always been a wild card among the gods. His loyalties were as shifting as the wind, and his sense of humor could never truly be predicted. But even Loki understood the gravity of the situation now. "Odin," Loki said, his voice quieter than usual, "I know you've been thinking about what comes next. But you must know, even with all your wisdom, there are things you cannot control." Odin nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in Loki's words. He had spent so many years trying to control the fate of the gods, trying to outmaneuver destiny itself. But in the end, even the mightiest of gods could not avoid their fate. "Ragnarok is inevitable," Odin said, his voice tinged with sadness. "But we still have a choice in how we face it. We can choose to fight, to resist, and to do everything we can to protect what we love. Or we can choose to surrender, to give in to the darkness, and let it consume us." Loki smiled, but it was a smile that held no humor, only the cold reflection of the reality that lay ahead. "And you, father," he said, his voice soft, "what will you choose?" Odin's gaze turned toward the horizon once more, his eye narrowing as he searched the skies for any sign of what was coming. "I will choose to fight," he said, his voice resolute, "but I will not fight alone." His words were a call to arms, a promise that even in the face of certain destruction, the gods would not abandon one another. As Odin's words echoed through the hall, a hush fell over the gathered gods, each one knowing that this was not a time for speeches or grand gestures. It was a time for action, for preparing for the battle that would define everything to come. One by one, the gods left the great hall, each headed to their own corner of Asgard to prepare for the coming war. Freya made her way to the fields of Vigrid, where the final battle would take place. She walked with a purpose, her mind focused on the role she would play in the fight to come. She would not wield a sword or a shield. No, her power was not in physical strength. Her strength lay in her ability to inspire, to lead, to rally the gods and warriors to fight with their heart, not just their weapons. She would stand beside Odin, beside Thor, and all the others, reminding them of why they fought, not for glory, not for pride, but for the future of the 9 realms. Thor, meanwhile, was already at the gates of Asgard, Mjolnir in hand, ready to face whatever challenges awaited him. He had always believed in his strength, in the power of his hammer to protect Asgard from any threat, but now, even he had doubts. He knew that the coming battle would test him in ways he could not yet comprehend. Still, he stood firm, his resolve hardening with every passing moment. His father had given him a task, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. Loki, as unpredictable as ever, had already disappeared into the shadows, slipping away from the others to plot his own course of action. No one knew exactly what Loki was planning. He never let his true intentions be known until it was too late. But one thing was certain: Loki would be a force to be reckoned with for good or ill, and the gods would have to rely on his cunning to navigate the chaos that was about to unfold. And so the gods prepared in their own ways, each one facing the coming storm with a mixture of determination and uncertainty. They knew that Ragnarok was upon them, but they did not know what would come after it. whether they would emerge victorious or whether the 9 realms would fall into ruin. What they did know was that they would face it together, with all the strength they could muster, and they would fight until the very last breath. As the winds began to howl louder, and the storm clouds gathered thick above, the gods made their way to the battlefield of Vigrid. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the final act to begin. And with that, the stage was set for the battle that would change everything. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the end of an era, and the beginning of something new. The twilight battle. The wind howled like a beast unleashed, its cold, biting gusts whipping across the desolate plains of Vigrid, where the final battle was about to unfold. The ground beneath the gods' feet trembled, as though the very earth itself knew that this was the moment it had been waiting for, the moment when all things would be tested and all promises would be broken or kept. The skies above, once a radiant blue, were now a tumultuous shade of grey, darkening with every passing moment as the storm of Ragnarok drew closer. As the gods gathered on the edge of the battlefield, they were a formidable sight, each one standing tall, their weapons gleaming under the sickly light that filtered through the clouds. Thor, his hammer Mjolnir at the ready, stood in the front, his broad shoulders squared against the coming tide of destruction. His muscles rippled beneath the weight of his armor, and his eyes, though filled with the usual fiery determination, carried an edge of uncertainty. He had fought countless battles, but this was something else entirely. This was not just another war, it was the war, the one that would determine whether the gods would survive or fall. Beside him stood Odin, his single eye narrowed against the wind, his long grey beard whipping around his face. The All-Father's once mighty presence was now burdened by the weight of centuries, his wisdom and power tempered with the understanding that even he could not predict what was to come. The gods had prepared for this day their entire lives, but no amount of preparation could truly ready them for the chaos that would soon unfold. Even Odin could feel the tremors deep within his soul, the echoes of ancient prophecies stirring, reminding him that Ragnarok was more than just a battle. It was a force of nature, an inevitability that would reshape the very fabric of existence itself. Freya, standing a little to the side, felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest like a stone. Her heart, once filled with love and warmth, was now cold with the knowledge that there would be no victory in this battle, no chance to celebrate or mourn after the clash. The gods had been preparing for this day for eons, but there was no escaping the truth now. This would be the end of their reign, the twilight of their world. Still, Freya stood tall, her golden hair shining despite the storm, her eyes focused on the horizon, where the armies of their enemies were beginning to emerge from the darkness. She had seen death countless times in her long life, but never before had it felt so imminent, so personal. And then there was Loki, his form a shadow among the gods, his mischievous grin nowhere to be found. The trickster god who had always been a wild card, a force of chaos that could never be fully trusted, stood silently beside his kin, his mind working in ways that no one could follow. Loki had never been one for honor or loyalty, but even he could not deny the gravity of the moment. He had his own plans, his own schemes, but for now, even he was forced to wait, forced to hold his cards close to his chest. The battlefield was no place for tricks, not today. The first sound of the enemy's approach reached their ears like the growl of a great beast, and the gods tensed, their weapons raised, their minds sharpened. The sky darkened even further, as if the very heavens were being torn apart by the weight of the coming battle. From the depths of the abyss, the armies of Jotunheim, the giants, began to emerge, their massive forms taking shape in the distance, blotting out the horizon with their terrifying presence. They were led by the monstrous figure of Sur, the fire giant, his eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to ignite the very air around him. Behind him, an army of Jotnar and other dark creatures followed, their enormous forms and terrifying features adding to the dread that already hung in the air. Thor gripped Mjolnir tightly, his knuckles white with the pressure, but he did not move. He had waited his entire life for this moment, and now the moment had finally come. But instead of charging headlong into battle, he found himself paralyzed by the weight of what this battle truly meant. This was not just about his strength or his hammer. This was about the survival of all the realm, the survival of everything he had ever known. The giants were not just enemies, they were the harbingers of destruction, the force that would shatter everything they had built. And with them came the forces of chaos, the very thing that threatened to undo the gods' order and cast the 9 realms into eternal darkness. Odin's voice broke through the silence that had settled over the gods, his words firm and commanding. "This is the moment we have prepared for," his voice carrying over the wind and the thunder that now began to roll across the sky. "We fight not for ourselves but for the future of all things. Stand strong, for the end is upon us, but through our strength we may carve a new beginning from the ashes." His words, though filled with wisdom, carried the weight of inevitability, and the gods nodded, understanding the gravity of what was about to unfold. No more speech, no more preparation. This was the moment of truth. The first clash came like the thunder itself, a deafening roar that shook the ground and sent ripples through the air. The giants charged forward, their massive forms moving with terrifying speed, and the gods met them with all the force of their power. Thor swung Mjolnir with all his might, the hammer crackling with the power of 1,000 storms, and the giant who met him was sent flying back, his great body crumbling beneath the weight of the blow. But the victory was short-lived, for the giants were relentless, and they came in waves, each one more brutal and more vicious than the last. Freya's voice rang out across the battle, a battle cry that lifted the spirits of the gods and warriors alike. Her spear glinted in the dim light as she led the charge, her presence a beacon of hope in the midst of the chaos. Her warriors followed, their swords flashing in the air as they engaged the Jotnar in a desperate struggle for survival. Freya fought with the grace and precision of a goddess, her every movement a dance of death as she struck down giant after giant, her heart pounding with the knowledge that even if they won this battle, it would not be enough to change the fate of the gods. Loki, ever the opportunist, slipped into the fray with a grin that no one could see, his hands moving quickly as he weaved between the combat, his mind working on a plan that would unfold later, perhaps even after the battle was done. He wasn't interested in fighting for the gods. No, he was interested in finding a way to come out on top when all was said and done. The destruction of Asgard, the fall of the gods. It was all just another game to him, one that he intended to win, no matter the cost. The battle raged on for hours, the gods and giants locked in a deadly struggle that seemed to have no end. The air was thick with the sounds of clashing metal, the screams of dying warriors, and the rumble of thunder as the heavens themselves seemed to echo the violence of the battle below. Thor fought on, his hammer never slowing, his mind focused solely on the enemies before him. But as the battle dragged on, the gods began to feel the toll of the endless fighting. They had fought for what felt like an eternity, and still the enemy kept coming, their numbers endless, their strength seemingly boundless. Odin, too, was beginning to tire, his mind worn from the endless strategizing, his body burdened by the weight of his years. Yet he fought on, his spear Gungnir, flashing through the air as he struck down any enemy foolish enough to come within reach. Even in the face of certain defeat, Odin refused to give up. He knew that this battle was the final test, the moment when the gods would either fall or rise. And then, as if the world itself had been waiting for the right moment, the sky split open with a flash of blinding light, and the figure of Soltrit, the fire giant, appeared on the battlefield, his massive form looming like a living mountain of flame and destruction. He was the embodiment of fire and fury, a force of nature that could not be contained or defeated by any mortal means. Thor, his heart racing, raised Mjolnir high and charged forward to meet the giant, but even as he swung the hammer with all his might, he knew this was no ordinary foe. Salt was the one who would bring the final flame, the one who would ignite the destruction that would consume the realms. With a roar that shook the heavens, Soltrit,
unleashed a wave of fire so powerful that it seemed to burn the very sky itself. The flames spread across the battlefield, consuming all in their path, and the gods were forced to retreat, their own power dwarfed by the sheer intensity of the fire. In that moment, as the flames roared around them, the gods understood the end was truly upon them, and there was no escape from the fire that would consume them all. But even in the face of such certain destruction, they fought on, their resolve unbroken, their spirits as fierce as the flames that surrounded them.
The end of the gods. As the flames of Surtur's inferno surged across the battlefield, there was no more time for hesitation. The gods, despite their weariness and the growing despair, pushed forward, their determination now as fierce as the fire that consumed the world around them. But even as they fought with all their might, they knew that this was not a battle they could win, not in the way they had always imagined victory to be. This was no ordinary war. This was the end, the final chapter in a story written in the very fabric of the universe. And no matter how hard they fought, the outcome was sealed. The gods had always known that this day would come, that Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, was inevitable. But even so, there was a part of each of them that had hoped it would be postponed, that somehow they would outwit fate, or that their strength would be enough to turn the tide. Now, standing amidst the burning chaos, the truth was impossible to ignore. There was no escape, no more tricks or last-minute plans to be made. The end was here, and the world they had fought so hard to protect was slipping through their fingers. Odin, with his one remaining eye fixed on the burning horizon, understood this better than anyone. His mind, always a whirl of strategy and foresight, had prepared him for many things, but nothing had prepared him for the overwhelming reality of what was happening before him. The gods were not invincible despite their immortality, and now, in the face of Surtur's flames, they were beginning to feel the weight of their own limitations. He had led his people through countless trials, always finding a way to survive, but now he could not find the answer, not this time. Thor, battered and bloodied, stood at his father's side, his grip on Mjolnir tightening with every passing second. The great hammer had served him well through countless battles, but now, against the overwhelming might of Surtur's fire, it felt like little more than a relic of a time long past. Thor swung Mjolnir with all his might, sending bolts of lightning crashing through the air, but the fire giant's flame simply swelled, consuming everything in its path, leaving nothing but ash and ruin behind. Thor's heart pounded in his chest heaving with the effort, but deep down, he knew it was hopeless. They were fighting a losing battle, one that they could not win, no matter how strong they were, no matter how much they believed in their cause. Freya, too, fought on, her spear flashing through the air as she cut down giants left and right, her warriors at her side, standing firm, even as the fire raged around them. But there was no joy in her move, no thrill of battle, no sense of victory or triumph. All she felt now was the cold realization that this was the end, that all their sacrifices, all their efforts to protect the realms, had led to this moment when everything would fall apart. Her heart, once so full of love and hope, now ached with the knowledge that she would never see the world the way it once was again. The 9 realms, so full of life and potential, were now a dying ember, fading into the darkness of oblivion. Loki, ever the master of misdirection, stood apart from the others, his mind racing with schemes and plans. But even he could not deny the overwhelming sense of inevitability that had descended upon the battlefield. The fire that consumed the land was not something he could manipulate, not something he could twist to his advantage, no matter how clever his tricks might be. He had always been a god of chaos, a god of change, but now, in the face of such raw destruction, he found himself powerless, unable to control the very forces he had always thought he could bend to his will. The thought was almost humbling, but Loki never allowed himself to dwell on such feelings for long. Instead, he took one last look at the battlefield, his eyes narrowing as he considered the options before him. For the first time in his life, Loki considered the possibility that perhaps this was not a game, that maybe there was no trick, no escape, no hidden escape route from the inevitable. He had always danced on the edge of destruction,
toying with fate and bending the rules. But now there were no more rules to break. Everything he had known, everything he had done, had led to this moment, and there was no turning back. But even as the flames spread, even as the giants and monsters continued their relentless advance, there was one force still standing in defiance of the darkness: the Valkyries. These fearless warrior women, chosen by Odin himself, fought with a ferocity unmatched by any mortal or god, their swords flashing like streaks of light in the darkened sky. Led by the mighty Brunhild, they cut through the chaos, their battle cries ringing out above the clamor of battle as they fought to defend what little of Asgard remained. The Valkyries were not ready to surrender, not yet. They would fight until the very last breath, for that was the way of their kind, and they would not let the gods fall without a fight. But despite their strength, despite their resolve, even the Valkyries could not hold back the tide of destruction forever. The flames of Surtur continued to spread, engulfing everything in its path, and the gods found themselves forced into retreat. The once proud halls of Asgard, the shining fortress that had stood for eons, were now little more than a ruin, their walls crumbling beneath the heat of the fire. The warriors of Valhalla, the gods' last line of defense, fought bravely, but there was no longer any hope of victory, no way to hold back the end. Odin, Thor and Freya gathered in the heart of the battlefield, their weary forms standing together as the flames raged around them. They exchanged a look, and in that look they shared an unspoken understanding. There was nothing more to be done. The end had come, and all they could do now was face it with the dignity and courage that had always defined them. Odin's single eye met Thor's, and the All-Father, his voice filled with a rare tenderness. "It is not the end of us, my son," he said, his words carrying the weight of centuries of wisdom and experience. "The world may fall, but we will not be forgotten. Our legacy will live on in the hearts of those who come after us, in the stories that will be told for generations to come. We may fall today, but our names will echo through the ages." Thor nodded, his heart heavy, but filled with pride at his father's words. "We fought for something greater than ourselves, Father," he said, his voice firm, despite the exhaustion in his body. "And that is enough." Freya, her eyes filled with a quiet sorrow, placed her hand on Thor's shoulder, offering him the comfort of her touch. "We have given everything," she said softly, "and that is all we could do." Her voice trembled with the finality of it all, but there was a certain peace in her words, a sense of acceptance that allowed her to face the inevitable with grace. Loki, standing a little apart from the others, could not help but watch the gods, his heart heavy with the weight of what had come to pass. He had played his part for better or worse, and now there was nothing left to be done. The world was burning, and the gods, for all their power and might, could not save it. Loki did not feel regret, not in the way one might expect, but there was something inside him that stirred, something unfamiliar. Perhaps it was the realization that all his tricks, all his clever schemes had ultimately led to nothing. The game had ended, and in the end there was no winning move. As the flames of Surtur's fire continued to consume the land, the gods stood together, their final moments marked by the quiet acceptance of what was to come. They would not beg for mercy. They would face the end with the same courage and strength that had defined their reign over the 9 realms. And though the world would burn, though their names would fade into legend, they would always remain, immortal in the stories told by those who remembered the gods who once ruled the world.
The rebirth of the world, as the dust of Ragnarok settled over the 9 realms, the once mighty gods lay defeated, their bodies scattered across the battlefield, consumed by the very flames that had sparked the end of an era. The heavens were silent, the sky darkened by the smoke and ash that hung heavy in the air, a testament to the devastation that had unfolded. The gods were no more, their reign ended, their stories woven into the fabric of history, destined to be retold in the whispers of the wind, in the songs sung by the surviving mortals who had lived to witness the end. But even in the darkest of times, there is always a flicker of hope, a spark that refuses to be extinguished, even as the world around it crumbles. For in the aftermath of Ragnarok, as the last embers of Surtur's fire burned out, the 9 realms were left to face a new beginning, a new chapter that no one could have predicted. In the quiet that followed the battle, the world seemed eerily still, as if holding its breath, waiting for anything to happen. The land was scarred, the seas boiled, and the skies still dark with smoke. But from the ashes, new life began to stir. It was subtle at first, the faintest tremor in the earth, the softest whisper of wind through the charred trees. Yet, as the days passed, the signs of rebirth grew more apparent, like the first signs of dawn breaking after a long and unforgiving night. Beneath the surface of the world, deep in the roots of Yggdrasil, the great world tree that had once connected all the realms, a stirring began. The roots, damaged and scorched by the flames of Surtur, began to regenerate, slowly at first, as if testing the waters, before growing stronger with each passing moment. From the ashes, new seeds were being planted, seeds that would eventually give birth to new realms, new gods, and new stories to be told. In the stillness of this new beginning, the first being to stir was a familiar presence. He had fallen, like all the others, during the final battle, but Odin was not yet ready to depart from the world that had been his to shape for so long. He had known that Ragnarok would come, had known that his time would end, but he had always believed in the power of renewal, in the possibility of life rising from death. And so, as the remnants of his old form lay scattered among the ruins, his spirit lingered, watching over the world with the wisdom he had accumulated over countless ages. From the depths of his being, Odin called out to the world, his voice a soft whisper on the wind, but powerful enough to reach the very heart of Yggdrasil. "Let the world be reborn," he whispered. "From the ashes of the old, let new life emerge." His words were carried by the winds, through the shattered remnants of Asgard, across the desolate plains of Midgard, and down into the deepest corners of Helheim, where the spirits of the departed still lingered. And as Odin's voice echoed through the realms, a change began to take shape. In the shattered remnants of Asgard, a new figure emerged from the ruins. Fra, the once great goddess of love, now reborn in a new form, her spirit as radiant as the sun she had once ruled over. Her eyes, filled with sorrow from the loss of her fellow gods, also held a flicker of hope, for she knew that the end of one age could lead to the beginning of another. Freya's heart, though heavy with grief, was filled with the resolve to protect the world that had been entrusted to her care. And so she began the task of rebuilding, of sowing the seeds for a new world to grow from the ashes. As Freya stood amidst the ruins, she felt the presence of the world tree, its roots slowly beginning to regrow, reaching out to touch the scorched earth beneath her feet. She understood that she was not alone in this task. She had not been chosen by Odin to carry this burden alone, but rather to lead the way for others to join in the effort to restore the balance of the world. From the destruction of the old, new gods would arise, gods who would stand beside her in the rebuilding of the 9 realms. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, Thor, too, was not ready to fade into oblivion. Though the weight of the battle had taken its toll on him, he could feel the pulse of the earth beneath him, the rhythmic thrum of life returning to the world. His hammer, Mjolnir, lay by his side, its power still strong, though its purpose had been fulfilled in the final battle. But Thor, with his boundless strength and unyielding spirit, understood that the work was not yet done. The gods might be gone, but there was still much to be done, much to rebuild. And so, as the winds of change swept through the realms, Thor took up his father's mantle, not as the god of thunder, but as the guardian of the new world that would soon rise from the ashes. He began to travel the realms, visiting Midgard, where the mortals had survived the destruction, and offering his strength to help them rebuild. His presence was a symbol of hope to the mortals who had feared that the world would remain a wasteland, never to recover from the devastation they had witnessed. As Thor traveled, he encountered others, beings who had once been enemies, who had once stood against the gods in the battle of Ragnarok. But in the aftermath of the great battle, they too had seen the need for change, for a new way of life. The giants of Jotunheim,
once fierce enemies of the gods, now stood alongside Thor in the task of rebuilding, working together to plant new seeds, to restore the land that had been scorched. The elves of Alfheim, too, played their part, their delicate hands carefully tending to the trees and the plants that began to sprout from the soil once more. In the dark corners of the world where the dead had once wandered, Hel, the ruler of the underworld, had not forgotten her role. Her realm, once filled with the spirits of the departed, was now a place of transformation, where the souls of those who had passed could find rest and peace. Though her domain was in the deepest reaches of the 9 realms, she too worked in concert with the other gods, using her influence to help guide the souls of the departed toward their next journey. For even death, it seemed, could be reborn, just as the world above had been. And so, piece by piece, the 9 realms began to heal, the cracks in the world slowly closing, as new gods and beings took their place in the grand design. The old ways, the old stories would never be forgotten, for they lived on in the hearts of the mortals who had survived the end of the gods. But the world was no longer bound by the past. It was free to grow, to change, to adapt, and in the years to come, the new world would emerge as something different, something stronger, something better than it had been before. As the new age began, there was a sense of peace, a feeling of closure that settled over the realms, even as new challenges arose. The gods were no more, but their legacy lived on, not in their power or their rule, but in the world they had helped create and the life that continued to flourish despite all odds. The world was different, yes, but it was still the same world, a world of infinite possibility, of endless cycles of life, death, and rebirth. And as the years passed, the stories of the gods faded into myth, their names whispered in the winds, remembered by those who had come after them, who would tell tales of the gods who had once walked the earth and the world they had shaped. The old gods were gone, but their influence remained embedded in the very fabric of the new world they had helped to create. A world where life would always find a way to endure, even in the face of the greatest challenges. For in the end, it was not the gods who held the world together, but the strength and resilience of the world itself, the unbreakable force that had carried it through the darkest of times and into the light of a new dawn.